Imagine thinking you've won. For Marcus Sterling, this was his divorce celebration dinner. Out with his new, younger girlfriend, celebrating the life he'd chosen. He had moved on. He had upgraded. But across the glistening restaurant, he sees a ghost from his past, his ex-wife, Sophia Reynolds. And she's not just surviving, she's radiant. Marcus watches, frozen in a haze of jealousy and disbelief as one of the richest men in Asia gets down on one knee and asks her to be his wife. Daniel Ashford. Not just any Daniel Ashford, but the Daniel Ashford, billionaire tech mogul, philanthropist, and most relevantly, Marcus's ultimate boss, the man whose empire he had spent years climbing, the figure he most admired and aspired to become. This isn't just a story about a chance encounter. It's about the ultimate power play and the moment a man realizes he didn't just lose his wife, he lost himself. Now let's dive in. The elevator hummed softly as it ascended the 68 floors of Meridian Tower, carrying Marcus Sterling toward what he believed would be the perfect evening. His reflection in the polished steel doors showed a man who had everything figured out, expensive suit tailored to perfection, confident smile, and beside him, the kind of woman that made other men turn their heads. Arya Chen adjusted her designer dress one final time, her phone already positioned for the inevitable Instagram photos. At 24, she was everything Marcus thought he wanted: young, beautiful, uncomplicated, and most importantly, impressed by his success. "This place is incredible, Marcus," she breathed, her eyes wide as the elevator doors opened to reveal Azure Heights, New Harbor City's most exclusive restaurant. The maitre d' recognized him immediately, of course. Marcus Sterling was the kind of client who commanded respect, senior vice president at Ashford Industries, owner of a portfolio worth millions, a man who had clawed his way to the top through sheer determination and ruthless ambition. "Only the best for you, sweetheart," Marcus replied, his hand finding the small of her back as they were led to their table. The restaurant occupied the entire top floor of Meridian Tower, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of New Harbor City's glittering skyline. Below them, the city pulsed with life, but up here, there was only refined elegance and the soft murmur of the elite. Marcus had reserved the best table, naturally. Corner position, panoramic views, and enough privacy for intimate conversation. As they settled into their seats, he felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came with being exactly where he belonged, at the top. "The wine list here is extraordinary," he said, signaling the sommelier. "I think we'll start with the 2015 Chateau d'Yquem." Arya's eyes lit up. "You're so sophisticated, Marcus. I never would have known what to order." It was exactly the kind of response that fed his ego. Unlike his ex-wife Sophia, who would have launched into a detailed discussion about wine regions and vintages, Arya simply admired his choices. No challenges, no intellectual sparring, no making him feel like he needed to prove himself. Just pure, uncomplicated appreciation. The divorce from Sophia had been finalized 8 months ago, and Marcus was finally beginning to feel like himself again. The man who had married Sophia Reynolds 3 years earlier had been different, younger, perhaps more idealistic, certainly less focused on what really mattered in life. Sophia had been brilliant, no doubt about that. A restoration architect with degrees from the most prestigious universities, published in academic journals, respected in her field. But brilliance, Marcus had learned, didn't translate to understanding what it took to succeed in the real world. Their marriage had been a slow decline, punctuated by Sophia's increasing criticism of his priorities. She didn't understand the demands of his career, the sacrifices necessary to climb the corporate ladder. While he was building empires, she was obsessing over old buildings and historical preservation, important work, perhaps, but hardly the stuff of real success. "Tell me about your day," Arya said, leaning forward with practiced interest. Her phone sat beside her plate, ready to capture the perfect moment. "Closed the Henderson deal," Marcus said, unable to keep the pride from his voice. 15 million in revenue, all from one signature. "That's amazing." Arya's enthusiasm was infectious, genuine in its simplicity. "You're so successful. I don't know how you do it." This was why their relationship worked. Arya celebrated his victories without trying to dissect them or suggest alternative approaches. She didn't question his methods or challenge his priorities. She simply appreciated the results and, in turn, made him feel like the powerful man he'd always known he could be. The sommelier arrived with their wine, performing the ritual of presentation and tasting with theatrical precision. Marcus nodded his approval, watching as the golden liquid was poured into crystal glasses that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. This was his world now, a world of excellence, refinement, and success. "A toast," he said, raising his glass. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," Arya echoed, her smile radiant in the candlelight. As they clinked glasses, Marcus felt a profound sense of rightness. This was how his life was supposed to be. No more arguments about his work schedule, no more lectures about balance and priorities, no more feeling like he was somehow failing by succeeding. Arya understood that his success was something to be celebrated, not criticized. The first course arrived, delicate amuse-bouches that were more art than food. Marcus barely tasted them, too busy savoring the moment, the ambience, the validation of his choices. Around them, other diners spoke in hushed tones, their conversations a symphony of wealth and influence. He recognized several faces, clothes, politicians, socialites. This was his tribe, the people who understood what really mattered. "The view is incredible," Arya said, her phone now in her hand, angling for the perfect shot. "Can you take a picture of me?" Marcus obliged, positioning her against the backdrop of the city lights. She was undeniably photogenic, her beauty enhanced by professional makeup and styling. Every inch of her was curated for maximum impact, from her designer dress to her carefully tousled hair. She was, he realized, the perfect accessory to his success. "Let me get one of us together," she said, switching to selfie mode. They leaned close, Marcus's arm around her shoulders, both smiling at the camera. "This is going to get so many likes." It occurred to Marcus that Sophia had never cared about likes or social media validation. She'd been more interested in intellectual discussions, in books and ideas and causes that seemed important to her but irrelevant to his real-world concerns. Looking back, he could see how fundamentally incompatible they'd been. Sophia had wanted a partner who shared her academic interests and social consciousness. Marcus had needed someone who appreciated his drive and ambition. The main course was a masterpiece of molecular gastronomy, deconstructed classics presented with artistic flair. Marcus found himself explaining the preparation to Arya, who listened with rapt attention. She asked the right questions, made appropriately impressed sounds, and never once suggested that perhaps the chef was being pretentious or that the presentation was more important than the substance. "You know so much about everything," she said admiringly. "I feel like I'm learning so much just being with you." It was a far cry from his conversations with Sophia, who had often known more about a subject than he did and wasn't shy about sharing her knowledge. With Arya, he was the teacher, the expert, the one with all the answers. It was, he had to admit, incredibly appealing. As they waited for dessert, Marcus allowed himself to survey the restaurant with the satisfaction of a man who had earned his place among the elite. The other diners were his peers now, successful, sophisticated, uncompromising in their pursuit of excellence. This was where he belonged, not in some modest apartment discussing the historical significance of building restoration techniques. "I still can't believe how lucky I am," Arya said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. 6 months ago, I was just another struggling influencer. Now look at me, dining at Azure Heights with the most successful man I know." Her gratitude was intoxicating. Sophia had never made him feel like he was enough, always pushing for more depth, more connection, more of something he couldn't quite define. Arya, by contrast, made him feel like a king simply by being himself. The dessert course arrived with theatrical flourish, a creation that involved liquid nitrogen and edible flowers. Marcus watched Arya's face light up with wonder, her phone immediately capturing every angle. She was so easy to please, so genuinely delighted by the finer things in life. Why had he ever thought he needed more complexity than this? "This is like a fairy tale," she murmured, tasting the dessert with obvious pleasure. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and it will all be a dream. Marcus felt a surge of masculine pride. He was the one making her dreams come true, the one who had elevated her from her ordinary life to this pinnacle of luxury. It was a powerful feeling, being someone's hero, someone's salvation. As they finished their meal, Marcus was already planning their next extravagant date. Perhaps a weekend in the mountains at that exclusive resort, or maybe a shopping trip to Milan. With Arya, the possibilities were endless, limited only by his imagination and his considerable resources. "Should we order coffee?" he asked, though he was reluctant for the evening to end. "Whatever you think is best," Arya replied, her default response to most decisions. It was refreshing, this lack of strong opinions about every little thing. Sophia would have launched into a detailed analysis of coffee origins and roasting techniques, probably segueing into a discussion about fair trade practices and economic inequality. As the waiter approached with the coffee service, Marcus felt a profound sense of contentment. This was his life now, successful, uncomplicated, filled with beautiful things and beautiful people. He had made the right choice in leaving Sophia behind. Some people were meant for greatness, and others were meant to hold them back. He was finally with someone who understood the difference. The coffee was exceptional, of course. Everything at Azure Heights was exceptional, which was exactly why Marcus chose to dine here. Arya documented the artistic presentation of the coffee service, her commentary a stream of superlatives and exclamation points. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Marcus found himself seeing the evening through her eyes, magical, perfect, the stuff of dreams. "Thank you for this incredible night," she said as they prepared to leave. "I'll never forget it." "There will be many more nights like this," Marcus assured her, meaning every word. This was just the beginning of their perfect life together. As they made their way toward the exit, Marcus felt like he was walking on air. He had everything he'd ever wanted: success, beauty, admiration, and the absolute certainty that he had made all the right choices. The past was behind him, and the future stretched ahead like a golden highway. He was so lost in his satisfaction that he almost missed it. Almost walked right past the table near the window where a familiar figure sat with her back to the room. But something made him look twice, some instinct or recognition that cut through his euphoria like a blade. The world seemed to slow as his brain processed what he was seeing. The graceful curve of a neck he had once kissed, the elegant posture he had once held, the dark hair he had once run his fingers through. It was impossible, but it was undeniable. Sophia Reynolds, his ex-wife, was sitting at a table by the window. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as the implications hit him. This was his place, his world, his moment of triumph. What was she doing here? Sophia had never liked places like Azure Heights, had always preferred casual cafes and ethnic restaurants with character and authenticity. She'd called places like this soulless temples to capitalism, more interested in impressing than nourishing. "Marcus." Arya's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." A ghost? Yes, that was exactly what this felt like. A specter from his past, materializing in his present to remind him of everything he'd tried to leave behind. He couldn't see who Sophia was dining with, just the back of a well-tailored suit and silver-touched hair that suggested an older, distinguished gentleman. Probably some boring academic colleague, Marcus told himself. A fellow preservation enthusiast or museum curator. The kind of earnest, intellectual man who would appreciate Sophia's depth and complexity but lack the drive and ambition to give her the life she deserved. "I'm fine," Marcus managed, though his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. "Just thought I recognized someone." But he couldn't look away. Even seated, Sophia commanded attention in a way that had nothing to do with flash or ostentation. She wore a simple navy dress that somehow looked more elegant than Arya's designer creation. There was something different about her, though Marcus couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. She seemed more present somehow. More fully herself than he remembered. "Is that your ex-wife?" Arya whispered, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. The word ex-wife from Arya's lips felt like a violation, too intimate and too casual at the same time. Marcus nodded curtly, not trusting himself to speak. Arya's eyes lit up with curiosity, the kind of prurient interest that beautiful young women often showed in the romantic histories of their older, successful boyfriends. Wow, what are the odds? She looks different than I expected. Different than what Arya expected based on the stories Marcus had told, the carefully curated narrative he'd constructed to justify his choices. In those stories, Sophia was a limitation, an anchor dragging him down, a woman too small and conventional for his large ambitions. Seeing her here, radiating a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the space around her, that narrative began to feel uncomfortably fragile. "We should go," Marcus said abruptly. The perfect evening was curdling into something else entirely, something that made his chest tight and his thoughts scramble. But as they moved toward the exit, Marcus couldn't resist one more glance back. What he saw made his heart stop. The silver-haired man was standing now, moving around the table to Sophia's side. Even from behind, there was something familiar about his bearing, something that triggered a deep, uncomfortable recognition in Marcus's mind. And then the man turned slightly, giving Marcus a profile view that sent shockwaves through his entire nervous system. It was Daniel Ashford. Not just any Daniel Ashford, but the Daniel Ashford, billionaire tech mogul, philanthropist, and most relevantly, the founder and CEO of Ashford Industries. Marcus's ultimate boss, the man whose empire he had spent years climbing, the figure he most admired and aspired to become. Daniel Ashford was having dinner with Sophia. Marcus's ex-wife was dining with the most powerful man Marcus knew, the man whose approval he craved more than anyone else's in the world. The implications crashed over Marcus like a tidal wave. This wasn't some random encounter or coincidental meeting. The intimacy of their posture, the way they leaned toward each other, the comfortable silence between them, this was clearly a romantic dinner. Daniel Ashford, the man Marcus had spent 3 years trying to impress, was dating his ex-wife. Marcus felt like he was drowning in plain sight, suffocating on the recycled air of the restaurant's climate control system. Around him, the conversations of the wealthy and powerful continued, but he could no longer make sense of the words. Everything had become white noise except for the thundering of his own pulse in his ears. "Marcus, seriously, what's wrong?" Arya's concern was cutting through his paralysis, but it felt distant and irrelevant. "You're scaring me." He tried to formulate a response, but before he could speak, something happened that shattered his world completely. Daniel Ashford, the most powerful man Marcus had ever encountered, slowly lowered himself to one knee beside Sophia's chair. The restaurant seemed to collectively hold its breath. Conversations died mid-sentence as other diners turned to witness the unfolding drama. Even the waitstaff paused in their choreographed service, sensing that something momentous was happening. Marcus watched in horrified fascination as Daniel produced a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. Even from across the room, the ring inside caught the light and exploded into brilliant fire, a diamond so large and perfect it seemed to bend reality around itself. Sophia's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with surprise and something else, joy, pure and radiant and impossible to mistake. Marcus had never seen that expression on her face during their entire marriage, had never inspired that kind of unguarded happiness. The words Daniel spoke were too quiet to hear over the ambient noise of the restaurant, but his expression was one of complete sincerity. This wasn't a calculated business move or a publicity stunt. This was a man genuinely, profoundly in love, asking the woman he adored to be his wife. And Sophia, brilliant, complicated, impossible Sophia, was nodding yes. The restaurant erupted in spontaneous applause as Sophia threw her arms around Daniel's neck. Other diners were on their feet, strangers celebrating the romance of two people they didn't even know. It was the kind of moment that restored faith in love, in the possibility of happy endings, in the idea that sometimes the universe conspired to bring the right people together. For Marcus, it was the end of everything he thought he knew about his life. He stood frozen as his entire worldview crumbled around him. The narrative he'd constructed, successful man trades up from intellectual but limited wife to beautiful young woman who truly appreciates him, was revealed as not just false, but laughably deluded. He wasn't the winner in this story. He was the fool who had thrown away a diamond and convinced himself it was worthless glass. Oh my God, Arya breathed beside him, her phone already recording the scene. Marcus, do you know who that is? That's Daniel Ashford. He just proposed to your ex-wife. Yes, Marcus knew exactly who it was. It was the man whose respect he'd spent years trying to earn, whose approval meant more to him than almost anything else in the world. And that man had just asked Sophia Reynolds, the woman Marcus had divorced because she wasn't ambitious enough, wasn't impressive enough, wasn't enough to be his wife. The power dynamics that had defined Marcus's adult life had just been inverted with the force of a nuclear explosion. The woman he'd thought was beneath him was now engaged to the man he most aspired to become. The intellectual pursuits he'd dismissed as impractical hobbies had somehow caught the attention of one of the world's most successful entrepreneurs. The depth and complexity he'd found so tiresome had apparently been exactly what a billionaire genius was looking for in a partner. As Sophia and Daniel made their way through the crowd of well-wishers, Marcus caught a glimpse of his ex-wife's face. She was transformed, glowing with a happiness so pure it was almost painful to witness. This was the woman he'd lived with for 3 years, and he was seeing a version of her that had never existed during their marriage. Not because she was incapable of such joy, but because he had never been able to inspire it. They passed close enough for Marcus to see the ring clearly, not just large, but exquisite, a piece of jewelry that belonged in a museum. The kind of ring that a man bought when money was truly no object, when the only consideration was finding something worthy of the woman who would wear it. Sophia looked up as they passed, her eyes meeting Marcus's for just a moment. There was no anger there, no triumph, no desire for revenge. Just a kind of distant recognition, the way one might acknowledge a casual acquaintance. The complete absence of emotional investment was somehow more devastating than hatred would have been. And then they were gone, swept away by the celebration and the good wishes of New Harbor City's elite, leaving Marcus standing in the wreckage of his certainties. "We should probably go," Arya said quietly. The festive atmosphere had highlighted the awkwardness of their position, the ex-husband and his young girlfriend, witnesses to a fairy tale that made their own relationship look suddenly tawdry by comparison. Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As they made their way to the elevator, he felt the weight of every gaze in the restaurant. Some sympathetic, some curious, some undoubtedly recognizing the delicious irony of the situation. Marcus Sterling, Ashford Industries' golden boy, publicly upstaged by the woman he'd discarded. The elevator ride down 68 floors felt like a descent into hell. Arya chattered nervously, trying to fill the silence with observations about the evening's drama, but Marcus barely heard her. His mind was reeling, trying to process what he'd witnessed, trying to understand how his perfectly ordered world had collapsed so completely in the space of 5 minutes. By the time they reached the street level, Marcus felt like a different person than the man who had ascended to Azure Heights just 3 hours earlier. That man had been confident, successful, certain of his choices and his worth. This man was a stranger to himself, forced to confront the possibility that everything he'd believed about his life was wrong. The city lights that had looked so beautiful from above now seemed harsh and unforgiving. The streets that had felt like his kingdom now felt like a maze with no exit. And somewhere above them, in the restaurant he'd thought of as his personal victory lap, the woman he'd divorced was celebrating her engagement to the man he'd spent years trying to become. Marcus Sterling had never felt smaller in his entire life. The penthouse apartment that had always felt like a symbol of Marcus's success now seemed like a mausoleum. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the New Harbor City skyline as the first light of dawn painted the buildings in shades of gold and pink. He'd been standing there for hours, unable to sleep, unable to think about anything except what he'd witnessed at Azure Heights. Arya had finally gone home around 2 in the morning, her attempts at comfort and conversation having fallen on deaf ears. She tried to make sense of the evening, to minimize its significance, to reassure Marcus that it didn't change anything between them. But her words had felt hollow, like trying to patch a dam with tissue paper. "It's just weird timing," she'd said, curled up on his leather sofa. "I mean, what are the odds? But it doesn't mean anything, right? You're better off without her anyway. That's what you always said." What he'd always said. Marcus found himself questioning every story he'd told about his marriage, every justification he'd given for the divorce. Had he really believed Sophia was holding him back, or had he simply needed to believe it to justify his choices? His phone buzzed with notifications, missed calls from colleagues, text messages from friends who'd heard about the spectacle at Azure Heights. News traveled fast in their circle, especially news this deliciously scandalous. Marcus Sterling's ex-wife getting engaged to Daniel Ashford was the kind of story that would fuel gossip for months. He ignored the messages, unable to face the mixture of sympathy and barely concealed amusement he knew he'd find there. Instead, he opened his laptop and did something he hadn't done since the divorce was finalized. He searched for Sophia Reynolds. What he found made his stomach clench with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Sophia's professional website showed a woman at the top of her field, with a portfolio of projects that took his breath away. Historic buildings brought back to life with stunning sensitivity and innovation. Awards from international preservation societies. Speaking engagements at prestigious conferences around the world. There were photos of her at work sites, wearing a hard hat and gesturing at architectural drawings, surrounded by teams of construction workers and fellow architects who clearly respected her expertise. This wasn't the quiet, bookish woman he remembered from their marriage. This was a leader, a visionary, someone making a real difference in the world. Marcus scrolled through testimonials from clients and colleagues, each one painting a picture of Sophia as brilliant, dedicated, and passionate about her work. One quote from a museum director particularly stung. "Dr. Reynolds doesn't just restore buildings, she resurrects souls." Her work on the Old Harbor District brought an entire community back to life. He found articles about her research, papers she'd published in academic journals that he'd never bothered to read during their marriage. The titles alone revealed a depth of knowledge and expertise that he'd dismissed as academic navel-gazing. Now, seeing the impact of her work, the recognition she'd earned from peers around the world, his dismissal seemed not just wrong but actively cruel. There were photos from recent months that showed a different Sophia than the one he'd lived with. She looked confident, vibrant, fully herself in a way that made Marcus realize how diminished she'd been during their marriage. Had he done that to her? Had his constant subtle criticisms and dismissals slowly eroded her sense of self until she'd been a shadow of who she was meant to be? The possibility was too painful to contemplate directly, but it lurked at the edges of his consciousness like a cancer. Marcus had always prided himself on being supportive of Sophia's career, but looking back with brutal honesty, he could see how that support had been conditional. He'd encouraged her work as long as it didn't interfere with his priorities, praised her achievements as long as they didn't outshine his own, celebrated her passion as long as it remained secondary to his ambitions. He found a recent interview Sophia had given to an architecture magazine, the headline reading, "Rising Star Sophia Reynolds on Building the Future While Honoring the Past." In the accompanying photo, she was standing in front of a beautifully restored colonial-era building, her smile radiant with professional pride. The interview touched on her philosophy of preservation, her innovative techniques, and her vision for sustainable urban development. Nowhere in the article was there any mention of her personal life, no reference to her recent divorce or her relationship with Daniel Ashford. Sophia's identity was entirely her own, defined by her work and her achievements rather than her romantic attachments. It was a stark contrast to Aria, whose entire sense of self seemed tied to her relationship with Marcus and her social media presence. Marcus closed the laptop, unable to bear any more evidence of how completely he'd misjudged the woman he'd married. He'd thought he was the prize in their relationship, the successful one whose career mattered most. Now he could see that Sophia had been building something far more meaningful than anything he'd achieved, a legacy that would outlast quarterly earnings reports and real estate deals. The morning news was filled with coverage of the engagement, though most outlets were respectfully vague about the details. Tech mogul Daniel Ashford engaged to renowned architect, read one headline. Another simply stated, "Billionaire philanthropist finds love." The photos showed Sophia and Daniel leaving Azure Heights hand in hand, both glowing with happiness. Marcus studied the photos with forensic intensity, trying to understand what Daniel Ashford saw in Sophia that he himself had failed to appreciate. They made a striking couple, Daniel's silver-haired sophistication complementing Sophia's intellectual beauty. But it was more than just appearances. There was something in their body language that spoke of genuine partnership, of two people who truly saw and valued each other. He remembered the comfortable silence he'd observed between them at the restaurant, so different from the constant chatter that characterized his relationship with Arya. He and Sophia had once shared that kind of comfortable intimacy, though Marcus realized now that he'd gradually eroded it with his need for constant validation and attention. His phone rang, interrupting his self-flagellation. The caller ID showed his assistant's number, and Marcus reluctantly answered. "Mr. Sterling? I hope I'm not calling too early, but you have the board meeting with Mr. Ashford at 9, and I wanted to confirm." Marcus's blood turned to ice. In all the chaos of the previous evening, he'd completely forgotten about his presentation to the board. The irony was so complete it almost felt scripted. Marcus Sterling, who had spent years climbing the corporate ladder to impress Daniel Ashford, had thrown away the one thing that could have truly connected him to the man he most admired. He'd traded a brilliant, passionate partner for a beautiful accessory, depth for superficiality, love for convenience. And now he was face to face with the consequences of those choices, forced to watch from the sidelines as the life he could have had unfolded before him like a dream he'd rejected as impossible. Marcus sank into his office chair and stared out at the city skyline, wondering how long it would take for the magnitude of his mistake to stop feeling like a physical wound. Somewhere out there, Sophia was probably planning her wedding to the most powerful man he knew, building a future that would dwarf anything Marcus had ever imagined for himself. He had been so certain that leaving her was the smart move, the strategic decision that would free him to achieve his true potential. Now he could see that his true potential had been sitting across the breakfast table from him every morning for 3 years, and he'd been too blind to recognize it. The phone calls and text messages from friends and colleagues continued throughout the day, each one a fresh reminder of his humiliation. Some were genuinely sympathetic, others barely concealed their amusement at the situation. Marcus found himself unable to respond to any of them with anything approaching grace or composure. By the time evening arrived, Marcus felt like he'd aged a decade in a single day. The confident, successful man who had taken Arya to dinner the night before was gone, replaced by someone he didn't recognize, someone small and lost and profoundly alone. The weeks that followed the engagement announcement were a slow-motion disaster for Marcus Sterling. What should have been a period of professional triumph, the Henderson deal had generated significant positive attention for Ashford Industries, instead became a daily exercise in humiliation and self-doubt. The industry was small enough that news of Daniel Ashford's engagement to Sophia Reynolds spread like wildfire through the business and academic communities. Marcus found himself the subject of whispered conversations and knowing looks wherever he went. The story was too perfect, too symbolically rich to ignore. Successful businessman dumps brilliant wife, only to watch her get engaged to his billionaire boss. Arya tried to maintain their relationship, but the dynamic between them had shifted irreparably. Where once she had seemed impressed by his success and sophistication, now she appeared increasingly aware of how diminished he'd become. Her Instagram posts, once filled with photos of their glamorous outings, became more focused on solo shots and carefully curated lifestyle content that didn't include him. "You're different," she said one evening as they sat in his penthouse, the silence between them growing increasingly uncomfortable. "Ever since that night at Azure Heights, it's like you're not even here anymore." Marcus looked at her sitting on his expensive sofa, her beauty unchanged but somehow less compelling than it had been before. Everything about their relationship that had once felt sophisticated and enviable now seemed hollow and performative. The age gap that had made him feel powerful now made him feel predatory. Her lack of intellectual curiosity, which had seemed refreshing after Sophia's constant questions and challenges, now felt like a void that no amount of luxury could fill. "I'm sorry," he said, though he wasn't sure what exactly he was apologizing for. "Work has been stressful." It wasn't entirely a lie. Work had indeed become stressful, but not in the way Arya understood. Marcus found himself second-guessing every decision, wondering if Daniel Ashford was evaluating his performance through the lens of his relationship with Sophia. Did his boss see him as the fool who had let a treasure slip through his fingers? Was his professional competence now forever tainted by his personal failures? The paranoia was probably unfounded. Daniel continued to treat him with the same professional courtesy he'd always shown. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being judged, measured against a standard that he'd already failed to meet in the most fundamental way possible. "Maybe we should take a break," Arya said suddenly, her words cutting through his brooding like a knife. Marcus looked at her, this beautiful young woman who had once seemed like the perfect prize for his success, and realized he felt nothing but a vague sense of relief at her suggestion. "Maybe we should," he agreed. They ended things quietly, without drama or recrimination. Arya packed up her few belongings from his apartment, some designer clothes he'd bought her, expensive jewelry, toiletries that had gradually migrated to his bathroom. As she prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you're still hung up on her. Your ex-wife. Maybe you should figure that out before you try to be with anyone else." After she left, Marcus sat alone in his penthouse, surrounded by all the symbols of his success. The expensive furniture, the original artwork, the panoramic view of the city, none of it felt meaningful anymore. He'd built this life as a monument to his achievements, but now it felt more like a mausoleum for his mistakes. He found himself obsessively following news of Sophia and Daniel's engagement, though doing so felt like picking at a wound that refused to heal. They were featured in lifestyle magazines as New Harbor City's power couple, photographed at charity galas and cultural events. In every image, Sophia looked radiant, confident, utterly herself in a way that Marcus realized she'd never been during their marriage. There was one photo that particularly haunted him, Sophia and Daniel at the groundbreaking ceremony for a new cultural center that their foundation was funding. Sophia was wearing a hard hat and holding architectural plans, clearly in her element as she explained some aspect of the project to the assembled dignitaries. Daniel stood beside her, his expression one of genuine admiration and respect for her expertise. Marcus had never looked at Sophia that way during their marriage. He'd supported her career in theory, but he'd never truly seen her as his equal, never recognized the depth of her talent and passion. To him, she'd been the wife of a successful businessman, her identity primarily defined by her relationship to him rather than her own achievements. Now, watching her shine in her professional element beside a man who clearly valued her for exactly who she was, Marcus began to understand the magnitude of what he'd lost. The realization led him down a path of increasingly obsessive self-examination. He started therapy, something he'd always dismissed as self-indulgent navel-gazing. Dr. Sarah Chen, his therapist, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who seemed immune to his attempts at charm and deflection. "Tell me about your marriage," she said during their third session. "It wasn't working," Marcus replied, the same explanation he'd given to everyone who'd asked. "We wanted different things." "What kinds of different things?" Marcus found himself struggling to articulate what had felt so clear-cut at the time. She was content with small things. Her academic work, her preservation projects. She didn't understand the bigger picture, the need to build something significant. "And what were you building?" The question caught Marcus off guard. What had he been building? Wealth, status, influence, but to what end? His real estate portfolio was impressive, his investment returns were substantial, but what lasting impact had any of it made? "Success," he said finally, the words sounding hollow even as he spoke it. "And you felt that Sophia was preventing you from achieving this success?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, remembering arguments they'd had about his work schedule, his priorities, his increasing distance from the man she'd married. "She wanted me to be someone I wasn't," he said. "Someone smaller. Or maybe," Dr. Chen suggested gently, "she wanted you to be someone you were afraid to become." The sessions continued, each one peeling away another layer of the justifications and rationalizations Marcus had built around his choices. He began to see patterns in his behavior that he'd never recognized before, his need for constant external validation, his fear of vulnerability, his tendency to diminish others in order to feel bigger himself. Most painfully, he began to understand how these patterns had played out in his marriage to Sophia. Every time she'd challenged him intellectually, he'd felt threatened rather than stimulated. Every time she'd pursued her own interests with passion, he'd felt abandoned rather than inspired. Every time she tried to engage him in deeper conversation about values, meaning, and purpose, he'd dismissed her concerns as impractical idealism. He'd wanted a wife who would reflect his success back to him, not a partner who would push him to grow and evolve. Sophia had been trying to build a life of meaning and connection, while Marcus had been building a fortress of achievement that ultimately trapped him inside his own insecurities. Meanwhile, the engagement festivities continued to play out in the public eye. Marcus learned through industry gossip that the wedding was planned for early spring, a small intimate ceremony followed by a reception at the restored heritage district that Sophia had helped bring back to life. The symbolism was perfect. They would celebrate their new beginning in a place that Sophia had literally brought back from the dead, surrounded by the tangible evidence of her life's work. Marcus found himself wondering if he would be invited. Probably not, given the awkwardness of the situation, but the question haunted him anyway. Would he want to go if he were invited? Would he be able to stand watching Sophia promise herself to another man, especially one who had achieved everything Marcus had ever dreamed of? The answer, he realized with painful clarity, was that he would want to go precisely because it would be torture. Some part of him felt that he deserved to witness his loss fully, to understand completely what he had thrown away. Dr. Chen called this self-punishment, a way of avoiding the real work of growth and change by wallowing in regret and self-pity instead. "What would you say to Sophia if you could speak to her now?" she asked during one session. Marcus had been dreading this question, though he'd known it was coming. What would he say? That he was sorry? That he'd made a mistake? That he finally understood what he'd lost? "I don't think she'd want to hear from me," he said. "That's not what I asked." "What would you want to say to her?" Marcus closed his eyes, trying to imagine that conversation. The Sophia in his mind was the radiant woman from the engagement photos, confident and happy and utterly beyond his reach. "I'd want to tell her that I finally see her," he said quietly. "That I understand now what I was too blind to see then. That she deserved so much better than what I gave her." "And how do you think she would respond?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "She'd probably say she already knows all of that. She'd probably say she hopes I've learned something that will help me be better in the future." "Would that be a bad response?" "No," Marcus admitted. "It would be exactly what I'd expect from her. Grace, even towards someone who didn't deserve it." The conversation stayed with him for days afterward. He found himself imagining that hypothetical encounter over and over, each time understanding more clearly the depth of Sophia's character and the shallowness of his own response to it. He began to research Sophia's work more thoroughly, reading her academic papers and studying her architectural projects with the attention he should have given them during their marriage. What he discovered was a body of work that was not just technically excellent but philosophically profound. Sophia wasn't just preserving old buildings, she was preserving cultural memory, community identity, the stories that gave places meaning. Her approach to restoration was innovative and sustainable, finding ways to honor historical integrity while meeting contemporary needs. She'd pioneered techniques for adaptive reuse that had been adopted by preservation societies around the world. The woman Marcus had dismissed as an impractical dreamer was actually a visionary whose work would outlast anything he would ever accomplish. The more he learned about her achievements, the more he understood why Daniel Ashford had fallen in love with her. It wasn't just her beauty or intelligence, though she possessed both in abundance. It was her depth, her integrity, her commitment to something larger than herself. She was building a legacy that mattered, creating meaning rather than just accumulating wealth. Marcus realized that this was what he'd been afraid of during their marriage. Not that Sophia would hold him back, but that she would challenge him to become something more than just successful. She'd wanted him to find purpose beyond profit, to build something that would make the world better rather than just making himself richer. He'd been too insecure, too afraid of vulnerability, to rise to that challenge. Instead, he'd chosen the easier path of finding someone who would affirm his existing priorities rather than pushing him to grow. The realization was devastating and liberating at the same time. Devastating because it confirmed that he'd thrown away something irreplaceable. Liberating because it finally gave him a clear picture of what he needed to change about himself. Marcus began making different choices. He started volunteering with a nonprofit that provided housing for low-income families, using his real estate expertise to help people rather than just profit from them. He read voraciously, diving into books about architecture, history, philosophy, subjects that Sophia had always loved and that he dismissed as irrelevant to practical success. He cut back on his social life, avoiding the charity galas and networking events that had once seemed so important. Instead, he spent time alone, thinking, reflecting, trying to understand who he really was beneath all the layers of ambition and achievement. The changes were subtle at first, but colleagues began to notice. His presentations at work became more thoughtful, less focused on pure profit and more concerned with sustainable value creation. He started asking different questions in meetings, considering long-term impact rather than just short-term gains. Daniel Ashford noticed too, though he never commented directly. There were small signs, a nod of approval during a presentation, a brief word of praise for a particularly innovative solution. Marcus found himself caring less about his boss's approval and more about doing work that actually mattered. The transformation was slow and often painful. There were days when Marcus felt like he was grieving not just the loss of Sophia, but the death of his old self, the confident, successful man who'd never questioned his priorities or methods. That man had been limited and ultimately hollow, but he'd also been easier to be than this new version who constantly questioned and doubted and strived for something he couldn't quite define. Dr. Chin helped him understand that this discomfort was part of the process. Growth is uncomfortable by definition, she explained. If it felt easy, you wouldn't be changing anything fundamental about yourself. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it, Marcus admitted. This version of myself that I'm trying to become, I'm not even sure he's better than the old version. At least the old Marcus got things done. What kinds of things? Marcus thought about it. Deals. Acquisitions. Profit. And what kinds of things is the new Marcus getting done? He considered the question. In the past few months, he'd helped 3 families secure affordable housing. He'd donated anonymously to Sophia's Preservation Foundation. He'd started reading to children at the local library on weekends. None of it was glamorous or impressive by his old standards, but all of it felt more meaningful than anything he'd accomplished in his previous life. Different things, he said finally. Better things. Maybe. I don't know. It's hard to measure. Because you're measuring by different criteria now. That was exactly right. The metrics that had once defined success for Marcus, wealth, status, power, no longer felt like the most important measures of a life well lived. He was still figuring out what the new metrics should be, but he knew they had something to do with connection, meaning, and contribution to something larger than himself. It occurred to him that this was the conversation Sophia had been trying to have with him during their entire marriage. She'd been trying to help him see that there were different ways to define success, different kinds of legacy to build. He'd been too threatened by the suggestion to hear what she was really saying. Now, 6 months after their divorce and 3 months after her engagement to Daniel Ashford, Marcus was finally ready to have that conversation. The only problem was that Sophia had moved on, finding someone who was already fluent in the language she'd been trying to teach him. The irony was complete and devastating. Marcus had become the man Sophia had always believed he could be, but only after it was too late for them to build a life together based on that understanding. Marcus had been avoiding Sophia completely since the engagement announcement, but the city wasn't large enough for 2 people in their professional circles to never cross paths. The confrontation he'd been dreading finally came at the most public venue possible, the annual New Harbor City Business Excellence Awards, an event that drew the elite from every major industry. Marcus had considered skipping the ceremony, but his absence would have been noted and speculated about. Better to attend and maintain whatever dignity he could muster than to let his personal drama interfere with his professional obligations. He arrived early, hoping to claim a table toward the back of the ballroom where he could observe without being observed. The venue was the grand ballroom of the Oceanview Grand Hotel, all crystal chandeliers and marble columns, designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. As he nursed a whiskey at the bar, Marcus watched the arrivals with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a familiar tribe. There were the usual suspects, CEOs and politicians, socialites and philanthropists, all dressed in their finest and ready to network with ruthless efficiency. He spotted Daniel and Sophia the moment they entered the ballroom, and his breath caught in his throat. Sophia wore a midnight blue gown that seemed to have been designed specifically for her, elegant and sophisticated without being ostentatious. The engagement ring caught the light from the chandeliers, sending small rainbows dancing across the walls. But it was more than her appearance that stopped Marcus in his tracks. Sophia moved through the room with a confidence and grace that he'd never seen during their marriage. She greeted colleagues and dignitaries with genuine warmth, discussed her projects with passionate expertise, and stood beside Daniel as an equal partner rather than an accessory. Daniel, for his part, clearly adored her. Marcus watched his former boss's face as Sophia spoke to various guests, saw the pride and admiration that lit his features whenever she shared her insights about architecture or preservation. This wasn't a man who had acquired a beautiful wife to enhance his status. This was a man who had found someone who made him better, smarter, more complete. The realization was like a physical blow. This was what a real partnership looked like. This was what Marcus could have had if he'd been secure enough to value Sophia's brilliance rather than feeling threatened by it. As the evening progressed, Marcus found himself unable to look away from the couple. They moved through the crowd seamlessly, Daniel's business acumen complemented by Sophia's cultural expertise, her intellectual depth enhanced by his strategic vision. They were a team in the truest sense, each making the other stronger. During the dinner portion of the evening, Marcus found himself seated at a table with several other Ashford Industries executives. The conversation inevitably turned to Daniel's engagement, with various colleagues offering congratulations and observations about the couple. "They're perfect together," said Jennifer Walsh, the head of corporate communications. "I've never seen Mr. Ashford so happy. And Dr. Reynolds is brilliant. Did you see her presentation to the city council about the Heritage District renovation? She had them eating out of her hand. It's a smart match from a business perspective too," added Robert Kim from Strategic Planning. "Her connections in the cultural and academic worlds complement his technology and finance networks. They'll be unstoppable as a philanthropic force." Marcus listened to these observations with growing understanding of how completely he'd misread the situation during his marriage. He'd seen Sophia's interests as irrelevant to real-world success, when in fact they were incredibly valuable to someone with the vision to recognize their worth. The awards ceremony began with the usual parade of recognition for various achievements. Marcus tried to focus on the presentations, but his attention kept drifting to Sophia and Daniel's table near the front of the room. They listened attentively to each speaker, applauded enthusiastically for colleagues and competitors alike, and generally conducted themselves with the kind of gracious professionalism that came naturally to people secure in their own accomplishments. When Daniel was called to the stage to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award for his contributions to technology and philanthropy, Sophia's face lit up with such pure pride and joy that Marcus felt his heart clench with loss. He'd never inspired that expression during their entire marriage, had never achieved anything that made Sophia look at him with such unguarded admiration. Daniel's acceptance speech was eloquent and humble, acknowledging the teams and partners who had made his success possible. Near the end, he deviated from the typical formula. "I want to say something about partnership," he said, his eyes finding Sophia in the audience. "True success isn't just about individual achievement. It's about finding people who challenge you to be better than you thought possible, who see potential in you that you didn't even know existed. I've been fortunate to have many such partnerships in my professional life, but recently I've found the most important partnership of all." He paused, and Sophia's smile was radiant even from across the room. "To Sophia Reynolds, who has shown me that building a legacy isn't just about creating wealth or technology or even businesses. It's about preserving what matters, nurturing what has value, and creating something beautiful that will outlast us all. Thank you for teaching me what true success looks like." The applause was thunderous, but Marcus barely heard it over the roaring in his ears. Daniel's words were like a mirror reflecting back everything Marcus had failed to understand about his own marriage. Sophia hadn't been trying to limit his ambitions, she'd been trying to expand them, to help him see that there were more ways to measure a life than just financial achievement. As the evening wound down, Marcus found himself at the bar again, trying to work up the courage to approach Sophia. He'd been practicing what he might say to her for months, but now that the opportunity was actually presenting itself, all his prepared words seemed inadequate. The decision was made for him when Sophia approached the bar alone, Daniel having been pulled into a conversation with several city officials across the room. "Marcus," she said simply, her voice neither warm nor cold, just professionally neutral. "Sophia." He turned to face her fully, struck again by how radiant she looked. "Congratulations. On the engagement, and on Daniel's award. You both deserve every happiness." She studied his face for a moment, as if trying to determine his sincerity. "Thank you. That's kind of you to say." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them like a fog. Marcus knew this might be his only chance to say the things he'd been rehearsing in therapy, to offer some kind of closure to the chapter of their lives they'd shared. "Sophia, I want you to know," he began, then stopped, realizing how inadequate any apology would sound. What could he possibly say that would matter now? That he was sorry? That he'd made a mistake? That he finally understood what he'd lost? "What, Marcus?" Her voice was gentle but firm, the tone of someone who had moved beyond anger into something more challenging, indifference. "I want you to know that I see you now," he said finally, the words coming out in a rush. "I understand what I was too blind to see before. Your work, your passion, your vision, it was never small or impractical. It was bigger than anything I was building. I was just too insecure to recognize it." Sophia's expression softened slightly, though whether with pity or genuine emotion, Marcus couldn't tell. "I appreciate you saying that," she said. "But Marcus, I need you to understand something. I didn't need you to see me then, and I don't need your recognition now. I've always known my worth. The problem was that you convinced me to doubt it, to make myself smaller so you could feel bigger." Her words were like surgery without anesthesia, precise and devastating. Marcus felt the truth of them cut through every rationalization he'd constructed about their marriage. "I know," he whispered. "I know I did that. I'm sorry." "I believe you are sorry," Sophia said. "But apologies don't undo the damage, Marcus. They don't give me back the years I spent dimming my own light so yours could shine brighter. They don't erase the self-doubt you planted that I've had to work so hard to overcome." Marcus wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that he'd never meant to hurt her. But he could see in her eyes that she was finally telling him truths she'd probably wanted to say for years, and the least he could do was listen. "Daniel doesn't need me to be smaller," she continued. "He celebrates my successes as much as his own. He asks my opinion because he values my intelligence, not because he wants me to validate his decisions. He's proud of my work because he understands its importance, not because it reflects well on him." Each comparison was like a nail in the coffin of Marcus's old justifications. He could see the relationship she was describing: true partnership, mutual respect, shared growth. It was everything their marriage could have been if he'd been secure enough to let it develop. "I'm glad," he said, and meant it. "You deserve that kind of partnership. You always did." Sophia looked at him for a long moment, and Marcus thought he saw a flicker of something, not forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps a kind of closure. "I hope you find it too, Marcus. Someday. With someone who brings out the best in you, and who you can do the same for in return." Before he could respond, Daniel appeared at Sophia's side, his approach as smooth and natural as everything else about him. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all. "The car is ready when you are, darling." "Of course." Sophia turned back to Marcus one final time. "Take care of yourself, Marcus." As they walked away together, Marcus watched the easy intimacy between them, Daniel's protective hand on Sophia's back, the way she leaned into him slightly, the quiet conversation they shared as they moved through the crowd. They were already in their own world, their own story, and Marcus was definitively outside of it. He finished his drink and made his way to the exit, feeling hollowed out but somehow also cleaner, as if an infected wound had finally been properly drained. Sophia's words had been brutal, but they'd also been necessary. She'd held up a mirror to his behavior during their marriage, and while the reflection was ugly, it was also clarifying. For the first time since the divorce, Marcus felt like he truly understood what had gone wrong between them. It wasn't that they'd been incompatible or that they'd wanted different things. It was that Marcus had been too immature, too insecure, too focused on external validation to be the partner Sophia deserved. The man he was becoming, through therapy, through volunteer work, through genuine self-reflection, might have been able to build the kind of marriage Sophia was now creating with Daniel. But that man had emerged too late to save their relationship, and Marcus had to live with the consequences of his earlier failures. As he waited for his car outside the hotel, Marcus felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. The confrontation he'd been dreading for months was over, and while it had been painful, it had also been illuminating. Sophia was thriving, genuinely happy with a man who valued everything about her that Marcus had failed to appreciate. There was something beautiful about that, even through his own loss. Sophia deserved the love and partnership she'd found with Daniel, deserved to have her brilliance celebrated rather than minimized, deserved to build a life with someone who saw her as an equal rather than a reflection. Marcus's job now was to figure out how to build a life worth living from the ashes of his old assumptions. He'd lost Sophia, but in losing her, he'd also been forced to confront the limitations and insecurities that had made him unworthy of her in the first place. The man who had married Sophia Reynolds 3 years ago was gone, replaced by someone who was still figuring out who he wanted to become. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. The chance to rebuild himself from the ground up, to choose different values and priorities, to become someone who could deserve the kind of love he'd thrown away. As his car pulled up to the curb, Marcus took one last look at the hotel where Sophia and Daniel were probably still receiving congratulations and well wishes from their peers. Tomorrow, they would continue building their life together, creating something meaningful and lasting. And tomorrow, Marcus would continue the much harder work of building a new version of himself, one that could learn from his mistakes, grow from his failures, and perhaps someday become worthy of the kind of partnership he'd been too immature to value when he had it. The weeks following the confrontation at the awards ceremony brought an unexpected clarity to Marcus's life. The conversation with Sophia, painful as it had been, had finally closed a chapter that he'd been unable to finish on his own. Her words had been harsh but necessary, forcing him to confront the full extent of his failures as a husband and partner. But clarity, Marcus discovered, was different from peace. Understanding what he'd done wrong didn't automatically erase the consequences or make the path forward any clearer. If anything, the knowledge of how completely he'd misunderstood his own marriage made the loneliness of his current life feel more acute. His penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a museum dedicated to his shallow priorities. The expensive furniture, the original artwork, the panoramic view, all of it seemed to mock him with its emptiness. He'd built this space to impress visitors, but he rarely had visitors anymore. The social circle he'd cultivated during his marriage had largely aligned with Sophia after the divorce, and his relationship with Arya had been too shallow to generate lasting friendships. Marcus found himself spending more time at the office, partly because work was the one area where he still felt competent, and partly because the alternative was going home to his beautiful, empty apartment and confronting the full extent of his isolation. It was during one of these extended office sessions that he made a discovery that would reshape his understanding of his own story yet again. He was working late on the quarterly reports when he noticed that Daniel Ashford's office light was still on. This wasn't unusual. The CEO was known for his dedication and long hours, but something prompted Marcus to pay closer attention to his boss's schedule than he normally would. Over the next few days, Marcus began to notice patterns. Daniel arrived earlier than anyone else and left later than most. He took lunch meetings that stretched into the afternoon and dinner meetings that ran past 9 o'clock. His calendar was packed with appointments, board meetings, philanthropic commitments, and social obligations. It occurred to Marcus that he was observing the kind of schedule he himself had once kept, the relentless pursuit of professional excellence that had gradually consumed his personal life. But there was a crucial difference. Daniel seemed to navigate this demanding schedule without sacrificing his relationship with Sophia. If anything, their engagement had coincided with Daniel becoming even more effective and focused in his professional role. The contrast was instructive. Marcus had always assumed that his work demands were incompatible with the kind of deep, attentive partnership Sophia had wanted. He'd convinced himself that his long hours and professional focus were necessary sacrifices for success, and that Sophia's desire for more presence and connection was unrealistic. Watching Daniel manage an even more demanding professional life while clearly maintaining a strong relationship with Sophia, Marcus began to question this fundamental assumption. Maybe the problem hadn't been his workload. Maybe it had been his priorities and his approach to balancing them. During their marriage, Marcus had treated his relationship with Sophia as something that should accommodate his professional needs rather than something that deserved its own time and attention. He'd expected her to understand when work ran late, to accept canceled dinner plans and interrupted weekends, to be satisfied with whatever emotional energy he had left after giving his best to his career. Daniel, from what Marcus could observe, seemed to approach the balance differently. His professional commitments were no less demanding, but he appeared to protect certain boundaries around his personal time. Marcus noticed that Daniel rarely scheduled meetings on Friday evenings anymore. He'd started leaving the office by 7 on nights when he didn't have specific work obligations. And when he was with Sophia at public events, he was fully present with her rather than working the room or checking his phone constantly. The realization was humbling. Marcus had used his professional ambitions as an excuse for emotional unavailability, when what was really required was better boundaries and clearer priorities. Daniel had the same pressures and demands, but he'd figured out how to be successful professionally while still being fully engaged personally. This insight led Marcus to make some changes in his own approach to work. He started protecting his evenings and weekends more carefully, not because he had someone to spend them with, but because he was beginning to understand that constant work wasn't actually making him more successful. It was making him less capable of the kind of deep thinking and creative problem-solving that his job actually required. He also began to pay more attention to the way Daniel led meetings and managed his team. Marcus had always admired his boss's strategic thinking and business acumen, but now he noticed subtler aspects of Daniel's leadership style. The way he listened carefully to different perspectives before making decisions. The way he gave credit generously and took responsibility for failures. The way he invested in his employees' development even when it wasn't directly beneficial to the bottom line. These weren't just management techniques. They were reflections of character traits that would translate into being a better partner. Daniel's success wasn't built on dominating others or constantly proving his superiority. It was built on genuine competence combined with emotional intelligence and humility. Marcus began to see that his own approach to leadership and to his marriage had been infected by insecurity disguised as confidence. He'd felt the need to be the smartest person in every room, to have all the answers, to maintain control through superior knowledge or position. This had made him a less effective leader and, more importantly, an impossible partner. Sophia had never needed him to have all the answers. She'd needed him to be curious about her thoughts, supportive of her goals, willing to learn from her expertise in areas where she knew more than he did. Instead, he'd felt threatened by her knowledge and had responded by either dismissing it or trying to assert his authority in other areas. The contrast with Daniel's approach was stark. Marcus had watched his boss engage with Sophia at various events, and it was clear that Daniel genuinely respected her expertise. When she talked about architecture or historical preservation, Daniel listened with the same attention he gave to business presentations. He asked intelligent questions, offered relevant insights from his own experience, and clearly valued her perspective. This wasn't weakness or submission. It was the confidence of a man secure enough in his own accomplishments to appreciate excellence in others. Daniel didn't need to diminish Sophia to feel important himself. He could celebrate her successes as enthusiastically as his own because their partnership wasn't a zero-sum competition. Marcus began trying to apply these insights to his other relationships, with mixed results. His interactions with colleagues became more collaborative and less adversarial. He started asking more questions and making fewer pronouncements. He found himself genuinely interested in perspectives that differed from his own, rather than immediately looking for ways to prove them wrong. The changes were gradual and often uncomfortable. Marcus's old patterns of behavior had been built over decades, and replacing them with healthier approaches required constant conscious effort. There were meetings where he caught himself interrupting or dismissing ideas before fully considering them. There were social situations where he fell back into trying to impress rather than connect. But slowly, he began to notice that people responded differently to him. Colleagues seemed more willing to share their genuine thoughts rather than just telling him what they thought he wanted to hear. Subordinates brought him more creative solutions instead of just following his directions blindly. Even casual interactions with service workers, neighbors, and strangers felt more genuine and pleasant. Marcus realized that these changes in his professional behavior were preparing him for the possibility of a healthier romantic relationship in the future. He wasn't ready to date yet. The wounds from his marriage and the subsequent realization of his own failures were still too fresh. But he was beginning to understand what he would need to offer a partner when he was eventually ready to try again. The woman who might someday be willing to build a life with him would deserve the kind of attention and respect he'd failed to give Sophia. She would deserve a partner who celebrated her successes rather than feeling threatened by them, who listened to her thoughts rather than waiting for his turn to speak, who saw their relationship as an opportunity for mutual growth rather than a threat to his own. 6 months later, Marcus did something he'd never imagined to do. He sold his flashy penthouse. He resigned as CEO of his company, promoting his more than capable second-in-command. He sold the sports car, everything that had served as a prop for his fragile ego. With the money, he started a small anonymous fund. He made it his life mission was to provide seed capital for young, underprivileged entrepreneurs in rural Vietnam. The kind of people with passion projects and big ideas that the Marcus of old would have dismissed as a waste of time. He didn't put his name on it. He wasn't looking for credit. His life became quiet. Marcus moved into a small, simple apartment in a less fashionable district. He started visiting the historical sites he had ignored his whole life. He read the books Sophia used to love. He was in a way trying to excavate his own past to understand the man he had been and the man he had failed to become. One rainy afternoon a year later, he was sitting at a humble street-side cafe in the old quarter of Hanoi sipping a coffee. He was reading a newspaper when he saw a picture. It was Sophia and Daniel opening a new community learning center they had funded. They stood side by side, their smiles easy and genuine. Sophia was pregnant, her hand resting on a gentle swell beneath her dress. They were building a life, a family, a legacy. Marcus looked at the picture for a long time. There was no jealousy. There was no rage. The hollow ache that had haunted him for so long was finally gone. In its place was a quiet, bittersweet sense of peace. He had lost Sophia. He had lost the life he thought he wanted. But in losing it all, he was finally beginning the slow, arduous process of finding himself. His redemption would not be a grand public gesture. It would be a quiet internal one. It was the lifelong project of building a foundation for his soul, just as she had advised. It was the only architecture that lasts. And for the first time, Marcus was ready to start building. In the end, this was never a story about who won or who lost. It was a story about value. The value we see in others, and the value we must learn to find in ourselves. Sophia's journey wasn't about landing a billionaire. It was about reclaiming her own worth that had been there all along. And Marcus' journey, a much harder and lonelier road, was about realizing that true wealth isn't what you own, but what you build within your own soul. Sometimes hitting rock bottom is the only way to find a solid foundation to build upon. Thank you so much for joining us on this emotional journey. If this story touched you, please hit that like button as it truly helps our channel grow. Share this video with someone you think would appreciate a story of resilience and redemption. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into the complexities of the human heart. What did you think of Marcus' final act? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. Until next time.